When Gabriella's mother-in-law ripped her from her wheelchair at a crowded birthday party, screaming that she was faking her disability to steal from their family, the room fell silent. But what the cruel woman didn't know was that Gabriella had been hiding something far bigger than anyone imagined. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above the marble floors of the Whitfield estate, casting dancing shadows across the faces of guests who whispered behind champagne flutes. Gabriella Monroe sat in her wheelchair near the garden doors, watching her husband Daniel smile nervously as his mother held court in the center of the grand ballroom. It was his 35th birthday, and Constance Whitfield had spared no expense in reminding everyone exactly which family had the money and the power. Gabriella could feel the stares. She'd felt them for 3 years now, ever since she married Daniel against his family's wishes. The looks weren't new, but they never got easier. She was the black woman who'd somehow trapped their golden boy, or so the whispers went. The fact that she used a wheelchair only added fuel to their cruel speculation. In their eyes, she wasn't just the wrong race and the wrong class. She was damaged goods, a burden their son had foolishly taken on. What they didn't know, what none of them could see, was who Gabriella had been before the accident. She'd been fast, Olympic trial fast. Her legs had carried her across tracks from Atlanta to Portland. Her name rising in the world of competitive running sponsors had been calling. Her future had been bright and boundless. And then, one night 3 years ago, everything changed. Her nephew Jerome had called her, terrified, trapped in a neighborhood situation that was spiraling toward violence. Gabriella hadn't hesitated. She'd driven across town, picked him up, and was racing him to safety when another car ran a red light. The impact had shattered her spine, her pelvis, her future. The doctors said she'd never walk normally again. The chronic pain became her constant companion, and the wheelchair became necessary on the days when her body simply refused to cooperate. But she'd saved Jerome. That was what mattered. He was alive, thriving now in college, pre-med. Her career had ended, but his life had continued. She'd made that trade willingly, though the medical bills had bankrupted her completely. Daniel had been her physical therapist during recovery. He'd seen her strength, her determination, her refusal to be defined by what had happened to her. He'd fallen in love with who she was, not what she'd lost. His family had never understood that. To them, she was an opportunist who'd latched onto their son's wealth and sympathy. Gabriella reached for a glass of water on the nearby table, her hand trembling slightly from the effort of maintaining her composure in this hostile environment. Before her fingers could close around the glass, she heard the sharp click of heels on marble approaching fast. "Enough of this act!" The voice cut through the classical music and polite conversation like a blade. Constance Whitfield's perfectly manicured hands suddenly gripped the handles of Gabriella's wheelchair. The room went silent. Gabriella's heart hammered against her ribs as she felt herself being yanked backward. "Stop faking! You're just leeching off my son's money!" Constance screamed, her face contorted with rage and something that looked almost like satisfaction. She was done pretending to be civil. In front of 50 of their closest family and friends, she was going to expose what she believed was Gabriella's elaborate con. Constance tried to pull Gabriella from the chair, her hands clawing at Gabriella's arms. The sudden movement sent shooting pain through Gabriella's lower back and hips, the kind of pain that made the world tilt and blur. She gasped, gripping the armrest to keep from falling. Guests pulled out their phones. Some moved forward as if to help, but most stood frozen, shocked by the spectacle. Daniel finally broke from his paralysis and rushed over, gently pulling his mother's hands away from his wife. "Mom, stop! What are you doing?" His voice cracked with confusion and embarrassment. "I'm saving you from this leech!" Constance hissed, her eyes wild. "She wasn't in that chair when you met her in the hospital. She was walking then, wasn't she? And now suddenly she can't? She's playing you, Daniel. She's playing all of us." Gabriella felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who already thought so little of her. With trembling hands, she maneuvered her wheelchair backward, away from Constance. away from the crowd of staring faces. She turned and wheeled herself toward the hallway, her shoulders straight despite the pain radiating through her body. Daniel followed her, his footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. "Gabriella, wait. Please. I'm so sorry. She's worried about me. You know how she gets." Gabriella stopped and turned to face her husband, the man she loved, the man who had never quite found the courage to truly stand up to his family. "Worried about you?" Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Daniel, she just assaulted me in front of everyone at your birthday party. She called me a faker and a leech. And you're defending her?" "I'm not defending her," he said quickly, but his eyes couldn't meet hers. It's complicated. She's my mother. And I'm your wife." The silence between them stretched long and painful. Gabriella could see the war happening behind Daniel's eyes, the same war that had been raging since the day he'd proposed he loved her. She knew that. But his family's approval still meant everything to him, and she was the obstacle standing between him and their acceptance. Over the next 2 weeks, things deteriorated rapidly. Constance didn't apologize. Instead, she doubled down. She hired a private investigator to follow Gabriella, to capture proof of what she insisted was an elaborate fraud. Photos surfaced. Grainy images of Gabriella standing briefly to reach something on a high shelf, or taking a few supported steps from her wheelchair to her car. The context was stripped away, the reality of her fluctuating condition ignored. Constance presented these photos to Daniel as evidence, demanding he protect himself with a post-nuptial agreement. "She's going to take everything from you," Constance warned her son at a tense family meeting that Gabriella wasn't invited to but heard about later. "Divorce her now while you still can. Choose your inheritance or choose her, Daniel. You can't have both." What none of them knew, what Gabriella had kept carefully hidden for 2 years, was that she didn't need their money. She never had. While they whispered about her behind closed doors, while they plotted to remove her from their lives, Gabriella had been building something extraordinary. In the quiet hours of the day when Daniel was at work and the house was empty, she'd been developing a company. Using her background as an elite athlete and her painful first-hand experience with disability, she'd designed a revolutionary line of adaptive sports prosthetics and mobility equipment. The prototypes had started simply, modifications to existing equipment that would make it more functional, more comfortable, more empowering for disabled athletes. But Gabriella's engineering mind, sharpened by years of understanding her own body's biomechanics, had created something truly innovative. Her designs were lighter, more intuitive, more affordable than anything on the market. Jerome, her nephew, the young man she'd saved at the cost of her own career, had been her business partner from the beginning. He handled the administrative side while finishing his pre-med degree. Together, they'd been in quiet negotiations with investors and manufacturers for months. Gabriella had been terrified that if Constance discovered what she was doing, she'd find a way to sabotage it. So she'd kept silent, working from home, building her dream while the Whitfield family built their case against her. 3 weeks after the birthday party disaster, everything changed. A major international sports brand had been watching Gabriella's patents and prototypes they wanted in, not just as investors, but as full partners. The deal they offered was staggering, $15 million up front, with Gabriella retaining creative control and receiving royalties on every product sold. It was the kind of opportunity that changed lives, that changed generations. The same week the offer came through, Gabriella received an invitation to speak at the National Disability Rights Conference, one of the largest advocacy gatherings in the country. They wanted her to announce her company and her partnership on their main stage. The event would be broadcast live, streamed to millions. The conference was scheduled for the same weekend as the annual Whitfield family reunion, a sacred tradition that Daniel had never missed in his life. Gabriella sat Daniel down in their living room and laid it all out. The company, the deal, the speaking invitation, everything she'd been building in secret while his family tore her apart. Daniel stared at her, his mouth slightly open in shock. All this time, you've been building something that matters. Gabriella finished quietly. Something that will help people like me. People who've been told they're broken, that they're less than, that they should just accept being sidelined. She paused, her eyes meeting his. I'm speaking at the conference, Daniel. I'm announcing the company, and I need to know if you'll be there with me or if you'll be at your family's reunion. It was the clearest ultimatum she'd ever given him. Choose her, truly choose her, or let her go. For the first time since his mother had attacked her at the party, Gabriella saw something shift in Daniel's expression. Something that looked like clarity, like shame, like determination. I'm coming with you, he said, his voice stronger than she'd heard it in months. I should have been standing with you all along. They didn't tell his family the real reason they'd be missing the reunion. Let them think what they wanted. Gabriella was done explaining herself to people who'd already decided who she was. The conference hall was packed with over 2,000 attendees. With thousands more watching the live stream, Gabriella waited backstage, her heart pounding not with fear but with purpose. She'd fought too hard to get to this moment to let nerves stop her now. Daniel squeezed her hand, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt like they were truly on the same team. When her name was called, Gabriella wheeled herself onto the stage to thunderous applause. The lights were bright, the crowd was enormous, and for just a moment she remembered what it felt like to stand at the starting line of a race, ready to prove what she could do. My name is Gabriella Monroe, she began, her voice clear and strong. 3 years ago, I made a choice that cost me my athletic career. I saved my nephew's life, and the accident that followed left me with chronic pain and limited mobility. I went from being an Olympic hopeful to being someone that people pitied, dismissed, and doubted. She paused, letting her words sink in. But what I learned is that disability is not inability. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. And sometimes the people who try to limit you are actually showing you exactly what you're capable of overcoming. For the next 20 minutes, Gabriella spoke about her journey, about the company she'd built, about the partnership that would bring affordable adaptive equipment to athletes across the world. She talked about resilience, about refusing to be defined by others' prejudices, about building something meaningful from pain. When she announced the $15 million deal, the crowd erupted. When she called Jerome onto the stage and he spoke about how his aunt had saved his life and then shown him what it meant to turn tragedy into triumph, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The speech went viral within hours. At the Whitfield family reunion, someone turned on the television in the great room and found a news channel covering the conference. Constance Whitfield stood frozen as she watched the woman she'd called a faker, a leech, a gold digger, being celebrated on national television as an innovator, an entrepreneur, a hero. The headlines rolled across the bottom of the screen. Former Olympic hopeful turned tech entrepreneur revolutionizes adaptive sports. Gabriella Monroe's company valued at potential $50 million. From tragedy to triumph, the inspiring story of one woman's refusal to be limited. Constance's phone began to ring, then her sister's phone, then her daughter's. All their society friends, everyone who'd been at Daniel's birthday party, everyone who'd heard Constance's accusations, they were all calling, all watching, all realizing exactly what had just happened. The private investigation photos Constance had leaked to discredit Gabriella now made Constance look unspeakably cruel. The woman she'd tried to expose as a fraud was actually wealthier and more successful than anyone in the Whitfield family had ever been. Over the next few days, Daniel's phone exploded with messages from his siblings, suddenly eager to reconnect with Gabriella. His father sent a formal email congratulating them both. Friends who'd watched the birthday party incident in uncomfortable silence now reached out with effusive apologies. And Constance, proud. Constance, who'd never apologized for anything in her life, showed up at their door. Gabriella and Daniel returned from the conference to find her waiting on their porch, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual perfect composure shattered. She attempted an apology, her voice shaking as she claimed she'd only been trying to protect her son, that she'd been wrong, that she hadn't understood. Gabriella listened in silence, and then, as if on cue, her phone rang. She answered it on speaker. It was the CEO of the sports brand. Gabriella, we've been discussing your trajectory with the company, and we'd like to offer you a position as Chief Innovation Officer. The compensation package is $50 million over 5 years, plus stock options. Additionally, we're prepared to donate $10 million to establish a foundation in your name, specifically to provide equipment and training to disabled athletes from underprivileged communities. The silence on the porch was deafening. Constance's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally a desperate kind of regret. Gabriella ended the call and turned to her mother-in-law. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost kind. "Constance, you taught me something valuable. You showed me that my worth was never about your approval. For years, I let your judgment affect me. I let it make me small. But I don't need your acceptance now, and I never really did." Daniel stepped forward, and for the first time since Gabriella had known him, he spoke to his mother with absolute conviction. "Mom, you need to leave. And until you genuinely understand what you did wrong, not just that you were wrong about Gabriella's success, but that you were cruel and prejudiced and you attacked someone I love, don't come back." Constance opened her mouth to protest, but something in her son's expression stopped her. She turned and walked to her car, her shoulders slumped in a way Gabriella had never seen before. 6 months later, Gabriella's company had provided equipment to over 400 disabled athletes. Her foundation had awarded its first grants. Jerome was thriving in medical school, working part-time as her company's community outreach director. Daniel had cut his financial ties with his family trust, choosing instead to build a life based on his own values rather than inherited wealth. And Gabriella, she moved through the world on her own terms. Some days she used her wheelchair, some days a walker, some days the new prosthetics her company had developed. The choice was hers, and nobody else's judgment mattered anymore. On a bright Saturday morning, she visited a youth athletics program her foundation had established in an underprivileged neighborhood much like the one she'd rescued Jerome from years ago. A young black girl in a wheelchair, maybe 12 years old, watched Gabriella with wide, hopeful eyes. "Can I really do this?" the girl asked, looking at the adaptive racing equipment. "Everyone says I can't." Gabriella smiled, remembering every person who'd underestimated her, every moment she'd been told to accept less than she deserved. "They'll try to tell you what you can't do," she said softly. "Prove them wrong, not for them, for you." Gabriella didn't need to prove anything to the people who doubted her. She built an empire while they mocked her from the sidelines. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger, it's success they never saw coming. Never let anyone else's limitations become your reality. Your worth isn't their decision.